Hello. Welcome to the Menil collection. My name is Mary Magsman. I'm the manager of public programs here, and we're delighted to have you all here for our talk tonight with Dr. Richard Hylton, To Go Past Slavery, Rupture and Rapture in Joe Overstreet's Senegal Paintings. This program is presented in conjunction with the Joe Overstreet Taking Flight exhibition that was curated by Nathalie Dupaget, the Associate Curator of Modern Art here at the Menil. Please note that tonight's talk will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel at a later time. And looking ahead, I wanted to invite you all to our upcoming public programs. This Sunday, we have a book signing event at the Cy Twombly Gallery with artist Tacita Dean. And then on Monday, we will have an artist talk with Tacita Dean, Thomas Addis, a composer, and that will be moderated by Sarah Rothenberg, Artistic Director of Decamera. So we invite you to join us for those. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nathalie Dupaget, who will be introducing our guests tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Richard Hylton, who is visiting us from London, where he is currently a lecturer in contemporary art at SOAS, University of London. He has worked as an art historian, critic, curator since the early 1990s and has organized numerous major shows, primarily in the UK. And in 2018, Richard was awarded a PhD from Goldsmiths, University of London. A regular contributor to UK and US art publications, he serves on the editorial board of the journal Art History. His most recent and very brand new book is Donald Rodney, Art, Race, and the Body Politic, and it is the first book-length study of this artist's protean genre-crossing practice and its engagement with aesthetics, politics, humor, and the Black consciousness. I became familiar with Richard's work through a brilliant article he wrote on John Biggers, who is an artist that all of us here in Houston know very well. Richard examined Biggers' 6-month research trip to West Africa in 1957, the artist's subsequent book project titled Ananse, The Web of Life in Africa, and how that trip continued to reverberate in the artist's practice for the rest of his life. And I knew that Richard would be, a great person to write about Overstreet's Senegal paintings, which I hope many of you have had the chance to see just down the hall in the last gallery. These are paintings from 1993, so decades after John Biggers' trip, but they likewise emerged from the artist's transformative trip to the African continent, and similarly grapple with questions around Black diasporic experience, the history of enslavement, and abstraction as a vehicle for liberation. And much to my delight and the delight of our publications department, Richard agreed to write for the book. So that catalog for this show will be available in a few months' time. It includes a great essay by Richard, among others, and tonight we are all in for a treat with this lecture, which is a kind of preview of that essay, I think also a bit of an expansion on it. And his talk is entitled To Go Past Slavery, Rupture and Rapture in Joe Overstreet's Senegal Paintings.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you all for being here today. It's a great honor to be in Houston and to be invited. Just a word of thanks. I'm very appreciative to Nathalie, to Mary, to Tony, to Joseph for inviting me and working with me for the past year on the essay, and to have this opportunity to come back and to actually see the show. It's not very often you write on a show and you necessarily see the show, so it's wonderful. So I have a script here to keep me to time, because I know that time is quite tight, or I should focus my thoughts. So I've written a script here that I will read from. And as Nathalie says, I will be drawing to an extent from my essay, but since I've submitted that essay and looking at materials, I've thought of things that I should have put in the essay that aren't in the essay, and also trying to bring different things together in terms of how we might approach these works, these amazing, magnificent works by Joe Overstreet. So this is what I'm going to do. By 1992, the year Joe Overstreet began his series of paintings, collectively and officially referred to as Face the Door of No Return, abstraction had been an indelible part of what by then had been over a 40-year practice. During these intervening decades, Overstreet's painterly innovations have produced an array of works which pushed and pulled at the very idea of abstraction, not least that paintings necessarily needed either to remain entirely devoted to non-figurative image making, be hung flat against a wall, or that they would necessarily avoid social commentary. Oops, there we go. Strange Fruit, a reference to songwriter Abel Meeropol's eponymous anti-lynching song, famously recorded and performed by Billie Holiday in 1939. To North Star, a note to Harriet Tubman, abolitionist and emancipator of the enslaved, are early demonstrations of Overstreet's conceptions of what abstraction entailed. Furthermore, speaking in 2003 about his flight patterns paintings, included in this wonderful exhibition, and posthumously recounted by art critic Holland Cotter, Overstreet opined, "I was trying to create a reflection of what in my past I had felt had run parallel. Native Americans, African nomadic people, black people here who had no homes. There was a lot of homelessness in those years. We had survived with our art by rolling it up and moving it all over. So I made this art you could hang any place. I felt like a nomad myself with all the insensitivity in America." In many ways, the series Facing the Door of No Return appeared to be the antithesis of much of Overstreet's abstraction, large, expressive, seemingly devoid of graphic formalism of earlier work, most notably hung against the gallery wall. Titled To Go Past Slavery, Rupture and Rapture in Joe Overstreet's Senegal paintings, this talk considers the multifarious and interlocking narratives which might merit some consideration when looking to this remarkable series of works. To go past slavery is an expression which intrigued me when reading catalogues about Overstreet's earlier exhibitions of this work. What did he mean by this? Overstreet himself stated, "I needed to personalize my experience there through abstraction. I didn't want to just deal with the past, with the middle passage. I didn't need that. That's been fed. I didn't want to paint in sorrow. Going there allowed me to go past slavery, going to Senegal. That was a phase of history we must get past. The only way to do it is to face it head on and to understand that it wasn't just Europeans, but Africans also had a responsibility for it. What happened to people happened by design. I think these paintings represent optimism and hope, but I also wanted to capture the sense of the burden of African history." My reference to Rupture and Rapture is intended to highlight a sense of double consciousness which underpins this work. At once they speak to Overstreet's response to a somewhat somber and difficult pilgrimage to Gorée Island, and often belittled legacies of transatlantic genocide. Equally, their colour, markings and scale exude a remarkable dynamism and, as Overstreet says, optimism. There are multiple considerations or entry points to understanding the significance of these works, which close this exhibition taking flight. From Overstreet's travels to Senegal in the early 1990s, the relationship between the figurative and the abstract, the representational and the gestural aspects, equally the fusion of ideas regarding the broader field of Euro-American art history, as well as what we might call a continuum of African diasporic art, are considerations here. But first, to provide some context to this talk, I should offer you some explanation regarding my own interest in Overstreet's work, particularly regarding Facing the Door of No Return, or what I will mainly refer to as the Senegal paintings. In 2017, Tate Modern, London, staged the exhibition Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power. This exhibition featured the work of some 70 artists, all of whom, save for Andy Warhol, were African American. The exhibition was described, and I quote, as celebrating the work of black artists working in the United States in the 2 decades after 1963, at the height of the civil rights movement. Further, it was also noted, and I quote, during this turbulent time, these artists asked and answered many questions. How should an artist respond to political and cultural changes? Was there a black art or a black aesthetic? Should an artist create legible images to make abstract work, Artists in this show included Romare Bearden, Norman Lewis, Faith Ringgold, Elizabeth Catlett, and Petty Sarr. The show also included several artists known for their work with abstraction, sculptor Melvin Edwards and painters Armour Thomas, Sam Gilliam, and Guyanese-born British painter Frank Bolin. The show also included Joe Overstreet. Whilst the show undoubtedly offered an opportunity to experience many works in person, the sheer volume and historical art of the show led me to start thinking about the profile and extent to which this generation of American artists had only ever exhibited in London in survey-type exhibitions. Such a thought and critique set in train an area of interest I've continued to explore under the rubric of African American art in the international arena. Although the wider topic exceeds the focus of this talk, it does carry relevance to Joe Overstreet's Senegal paintings. Writing about Faith Ringgold's first solo exhibition in the UK in 2019 at the age of 89, I noted, in the post-war period, these major publicly funded galleries in London collectively carried a torch for American art. From Tate's numerous American survey shows dating from the mid-40s through to the 90s, to the Whitechapel's premiere of Jackson Pollock's paintings in 1958, or the controversy surrounding the purchase of Carl Andre's Equivalent 8 in 1973. London's deference to American art had been racially unequivocal, from Pollock to Rothko, Newman to Johns. By comparison, African-American artists born within striking distance of Ringgold, who was born in 1930, such as Bearden, Catlett, Lawrence, and Charles White, had all been forsaken by London. A notable caveat to this situation took place in 1972, where painter Sam Gilliam was one of 6 Americans, including the late Diane Arbus, Ron Davis, Richard Estes, James Nutt, and Keith Saunier, who all represented the United States at the Venice Biennale. Nevertheless, by the 1990s, when Overstreet was about to embark on his travels to Senegal, the history of American abstraction, or indeed the framing of American art, remained contentious. Within this context, Overstreet's Senegal paintings carry significance. My attention now turns to 2 separate but equally important considerations we can perhaps bear in mind when looking and thinking about the historical significance of Overstreet's Senegal paintings. First, his participation in Dakar 92, Senegal's first visual art biennale held in the West African capital city, Dakar. Incidentally, also taking place in 1992, and in relationship to the African American art in the international arena, was the hugely significant but perhaps long forgotten exhibition, Dream Singers, Storytellers, an African American presence, which included works by Joe Overstreet, Norman Lewis, Bill Traylor, Bessie Harvey, and at the time, emerging artists such as Lorna Simpson and Glenn Ligon. With the title taken from Langston Hughes' poem, My People, this show, curated by Americans Alison G. Weld and James Small and Japanese curator Seidu Serikuwawa, the exhibition was a collaboration between New Jersey State Museum and Fuki Fine Art Museum in Japan in 1992. Before New Jersey, it was presented at no fewer than 3 museums across Japan. Although presented 25 years before Soul of a Nation, it too ventured a more expansive view of African American art. Although the Senegal paintings are known to be the product of Overstreet's travel, less is known about the exhibition Across Currents, Synthesis in African American Abstract Painting. This exhibition was the official United States contribution to the Dakar Biennale in 1992. Overstreet was one of 5 artists included in the exhibition, curated by Corinne Jennings. This exhibition featured the works of Howard University alumni Mildred Thompson and Mary Lovelace O'Neill, a very young Leonardo Drew, Joe Overstreet, and again, Guyanese-born British artist Frank Bolin, who had since the late 1960s divided his time between New York and London. Jennings offered this perspective on the United States official contribution. Let me go back to this. The 5 men and women being shown here, moreover, have not sought mainstream acceptance. Rather, they quietly continue to pursue their own directions without the support that commercial acceptance provides. They all speak from a double consciousness, and they understand that this is their situation, as well as the process and history through which they have arrived in their particular places. The second consideration for contextualizing both Overstreet's visit and subsequent production of the Senegal paintings is what we might call an African diasporic continuum, involving the artist's pilgrimage to the African continent, where Overstreet succinctly conveyed the impact of his travels to Senegal with the words, "Africa lit me up." 30 years earlier, following his travels to Africa, John Biggers himself, an important figure, as we all know, in Houston, described his experience as a positive shock. He elaborated, "The journey to Africa was the most significant of my life's experiences. Living intimately with the African and understanding something of his problems enabled me to better understand my own. Thus strengthened, I gained a new confidence for the future." Biggers' words were reproduced in Anansi, The Web of Life in Africa, a book published by the University of Texas Press in 1962, which included a written account of his journey and 90 immaculate black and white monotone reproductions of drawings. Biggers' six-month UNESCO-funded travels took in French and British Togoland, Benin, French Dahomey, which was part of French West Africa, Nigeria, and newly independent Ghana. This was, This was a notable period of protests against desegregation in the US on the one hand and decolonization on the African continent on the other. But esteemed curator and historian of Biggers, Alvia J. Wardlow, notes, "It is difficult to imagine how Biggers could have ignored the political shifts that were happening around him and which so intrigued other African-American travelers such as Richard Wright. But Biggers himself would recount, I had witnessed great spectacles, solemn rites, and an unbelievable abundance of human vitality. I had been held spellbound by the Harvest Symphony glorified in the gold of evening, had been delighted by the warmth of washerwomen on the banks of rivers and streams, had been filled with wonder by the beauty of naked truth, of mind and body, that I had observed on the tranquil, grassy northern plains of Ghana." Though undergirded by a quest to experience and explore African art and culture and often compelling new visualizations, Biggers ventured a different portrayal of African life, one that appeared to show what he says colonialism had not left its mark on them. But besides the singularly important book, Anansi, The Web of Life in Africa, Biggers transformed his positive shock into paintings such as Kumasi Market from 1957 and Jubilee Ghana Harvest Festival. At the forefront of a new era of cultural engagement with Africa, Biggers, as a visual artist, was not alone in his travels. Jacob Lawrence made 2 trips to Nigeria in the 1960s. His visit in 1964 lasted 8 months and resulted in a solo exhibition the same year at the Mabari Club in Ibadan. This show included tempera gouache paintings on paper. Robert Cole Scott's 2-year artist in residence at the American Research Center in Cairo in 1964 has also been considered, and I quote, perhaps the most pivotal turning point in his life, resulting in, and I quote, significant and underappreciated body of work. However, unlike many of his American peers who had typically journeyed to the African continent during what was ostensibly their formative years, Overstreet's venture came much later, when he had already a long-established practice and was fast approaching 60. Equally, where the ventures of Biggers and Lawrence et al. Was a period marked by the heyday of post-colonial rule and the revival of Pan-Africanism, Overstreet's travels came after the Cold War era. Nevertheless, there was a particular significance to Overstreet's travels, coming at a time when new formations of African and African diasporic artistic activity had already been evolved in the US and Europe, arguably nowhere more than in New York, where Overstreet had lived since the 1950s. In 1984 came the opening of the Center for African Art, which would stage the critically divisive group exhibition, Africa Explores. And also the group exhibition Contemporary African Art, Changing Tradition was presented at the Studio Museum, signaling the institution's intention to explore the work of 9 artists from 6 countries in Africa whose work challenged notions of contemporary art from African countries. Such events are noteworthy because, as demonstrated by Overstreet's Senegal paintings, they were, to some extent, an antidote to high-profile yet problematic exhibitions such as Primitivism, held at the Museum of Modern Art, which in many respects ignored the importance of African diasporic art. Beyond the New York exhibition, Black Art Ancestral Legacy, African Impulse and African American Art, which opened in Dallas in 1989, explored the impact, and I quote, of Africa upon 20th century Black visual arts across the US and further afield in the Caribbean, and, I quote, demonstrating that expressions of diaspora exist throughout the Western Hemisphere. Alongside Senegal's fledgling visual arts biennale in the 1990s were also what Salimishha Tillet refers to, and I quote, coming home tours. In her essay, In the Shadow of the Castle, Transnationalism, African American Tourism, and Goree Island, Tillet noted that in the 1990s, we witnessed a surge in interest and take-up of travels to former slave ports on the African continent, known primarily for their grim contributions to the forcible transportation of human cargo. According to Tillet, this was because and I quote, there are so few formal symbols of the lives and contributions of enslaved African Americans in their immediate national landscape, post-civil rights. African American heritage tourists reappropriate sites and symbols of their forgotten history by returning to Africa to reclaim these particular slave ports. Besides those participating in the Dakar Biennale, there were other Americans who, like Overstreet, visited Gorey Island. Chester Higgins in 1970s and Carrie Mae Weems in the 1990s. Carrie Mae Weems created the phototext Almena Castle, Cape Coast, after visiting the House of Slaves on Gorey Island that same year. Also in 1994, photojournalist Higgins published the book Feeling the Spirit, Searching for the World for the People of Africa, which included images from earlier visits, such as this image here, The Door of No Return, made in 1972. In viewing the Senegal paintings today, we're encountering a unique visualization of transatlantic slavery, of loss, of survival and reinvention. Writes Overstreet, I took a ferry to Gorey Island and went to an edifice where I was told some 40 million Africans passed through the gate into slavery in the West. All along, I have been reconstructing the past and struggling with the notion of being an African American and of being displaced. Since Gorey, more than ever, I've had to face human bondage, sacrifice, trading human life and my life as an African who was forced to leave and be reconstructed. Over 300 years, from 1534 to 1848, Gorey, an island located 2 miles off the mainland of Senegal, had been an intrinsic part of the slave trade. Governed and fought over by the Portuguese, Dutch, British, French slave traders, the island included purpose-built house of slaves, what was described, and I quote, as a sinister human warehouse, where captured and enslaved Africans were chained and held against their will until forcibly boarded into their hundreds on slave ships for a merciless and putrid voyage across the Atlantic to the American continent and the Caribbean. Disease, illness, and most certainly despair could lead to premature expiration. Despite Overstreet's many intonations and the original foreboding title, Facing the Door of No Return, the work which make up the series are not somber affairs. They are physically and visually exhilarating, entirely compelling, and at times disorientating. These are enigmatic and monumental paintings, engaging with the African continent and attendant legacies of slavery through these works. The artist sought to address, contemplate, and pictorialize the legacy of the Middle Passage. Although primarily abstract, their composition, suggestive imagery, and color conspire to convey a multiplicity of ideas related to the traumatic turbulence of the Middle Passage, African cultural heritage, and Euro-American modernist painting. Overstreet described Gorey's reconstructed House of Slaves as having, and I quote, an awful, horrible design. He stood inside the space and paced out the scale of this lurid environment, the dimensions of 10 by 12 providing the size of 10 of the 13 paintings from the series. All the paintings share a distinct haptic textual quality. Corinne Jennings aptly described them in the following way as resembling those ancient walls in their texture and eroded markings. In his choice of a massive scale, Overstreet reflects upon the immensity of the Atlantic Ocean, the Middle Passage, and the vast, flat, arid plains of Senegal, end quote. In the main, their formation makes oblique reference to the symbol of a door that has been orientated horizontally. This figures in literal and metaphorical and cultural terms. On one level, the door speaks to the harsh, brutal destiny awaiting those wretched captives who were chained and confined tortuously close to the architectural aperture facing out to the Atlantic Ocean, with its furious waves and angry winds. Laden by chains, the enslaved waited, being forcibly taken from the calaboose and boarded onto slave ships in single file through the door of no return. The torment of Middle Passage is itself expressed in overlapping and interweaving patterns, shape and form. All the works share an intensity of colour, pattern and form, and commonly devoid of pictorial depth. The painting Gory exemplifies what curator Thomas Pichet Jr. describes as a foreground scrim, or what we might think of as a layering. Perhaps even here, the compression of pictorial space functions as an allegory of claustrophobia, of the house of slaves, of being chained, starved, entombed on a slaver. In Overstreet's paintings, a sense of ambiguity still exists insofar as they are not entirely abstract or figurative. Perhaps this signifies Overstreet's attempts to grasp, to understand the horror of the transatlantic slave trade. He writes, "In them, I am asking for an explanation and struggling to explain it to myself." Other works from the series are connected to other locations in Dakar visited by Overstreet, which bring a greater sense of longevity and selfhood to the work and exemplify his desire to go past slavery. For example, baobab and fish refers to the large bulbous tree, the baobab or the Andersonia, which Overstreet would have seen in and around Dakar, and which dates from the pre-colonial era, and to this day still provides fruit. The artist conjures the tree, suggesting sustenance and life aplenty, amidst a dramatic maelstrom of colour. Although the gestural is evident in this work, there is an underlying structure which went into their production. Documentation of Overstreet working on exchange reveals a monochrome line drawing constituting 36 square gridded structure, which contains an intricate compositional device known as a golden spiral. This geometric pattern is derived from the Fibonacci sequence, named after the 12th century Italian mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci, and said to explain order in the natural world, wherein numbers accumulate by adding their two preceding figures. For example, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. It's quite difficult to follow. Although ultimately hidden from view in this painting Exchange, this rudimentary drawing played an important role in the painting's compositional arrangement. In the artist's words, the golden spiral gave him, and I quote, something to hold on to ensure that, and again I quote, the painting wouldn't fall apart. The appeal of the Fibonacci sequence harbours deeper roots as it chimes with Overstreet's upbringing and interest in what he described as a, and I quote, a very raw environment of many textures of trees, red earth, animals, wood, leaves, water and weeds. Iconography from the natural world also figures prominently in the series. In Exchange, the cowrie shell, a symbol of fertility and once used as a form of currency, notably in the selling and buying of an enslaved, is rendered as a coastly pattern or apparition across the canvas. Although primarily abstract works, Overstreet's series draws on a variety of other recognizable iconography, including the aforementioned cowrie shells, fruit, fish, and textiles. The titles also evoke a sense of confrontation with and contemplation of a site of unimaginable horror as a memorial to the residue of human degradation. Exit Dust is a compelling and all-consuming painting, much in keeping with others in the series. Amid its turbulent and pulsating colour scheme, flourishes redolent of Impressionism, marshal each side of the painter's central vortex, in which yellow and orange resemble clusters of fruit spewing forth. Its title alludes to land, possibly Senegal's windswept land. But such is the nature of the composition, and its intricate markings denote certain figures and forms. The painted swirling patterns, intense but complementary colour scheme, and a sense of motion subtly evoke the art historical canon. Overstreet would state, "I am thinking of these works in relation to Impressionism." Described by art historian Thomas Machiavelli as the big palpitating canvas, Exit Dust has elements which recall Claude Monet's Water Lilies, a genteel but monumental series of paintings of the artist's self-made flower gardens and ponds in his Gauvigny estate in Normandy. Overstreet's allusion to Impressionism functions like many other of his cultural and artistic influences, extending beyond an exclusive African-American idiom. But equally, what John Sesenbach separately characterizes as, and I quote, middle-class pleasures and agrarian nostalgia of Impressionism appears somewhat incongruous in conjunction with the violence of Atlantic plantation societies. It should be noted the ending of American plantation slavery began in 1865. However, Sesenbach identifies often understated links between, and I quote, the father of Impressionism, Camille Pissarro, and what has been dubbed the Black Atlantic. Born into a slaveholding family during the height of slavery in 1830 on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas, then a Danish colony, Pissarro, according to Sesenbach, was heavily influenced by this upbringing, witnessing slave revolts at first hand. And, as Sesenbach says, he also says, the movement that came to be called Impressionism and modern Western art generally was entwined with the political and social upheavals of mid-19th century France. The Revolution of 1848, the coup of Napoleon III, the Haussmann redesign of Paris, war with Prussia, and the Commune of 1871. Less understood is that the Impressionists, almost all of them, born in the 1830s and 1840s, also came of age during the downfall of Atlantic slavery and the emergence of new debates about citizenship for former slaves, the relationship of free labor to capital and race. Whereas the age of emancipation left little direct impact on some artists, it became a defining, formative experience for others. The world of Impressionism was more thoroughly enmeshed with 19th century Black Atlantic than is usually recognized, with implications for the origins of modern art, end quote. Pissarro's depiction of post-emancipation St. Thomas ventured dignified portrayals of black people as, and what Sesenbach describes as figures of respect, not fear, condescension, or symbolic transcendence. Such possible linkages inflect Overstreet's allusions to Impressionism. They also offer a counterpoint to more familiar canonical depictions of violent racial subjection, namely J.M.W. Turner's Slave Ship from 1840, a pioneer to the infamous Song Massacre, which Exit Dust seems to obliquely recall. The endless synergy between form and subject matter, tradition and innovation, allegory and representation are key to Exit Dust, as they are to Overstreet's entire series. I think, yes. Overstreet first exhibited facing the door of no return at Kenkeliber House, New York in 1993. This was the first and only time the series was presented in its entirety. Works from the series were subsequently included in exhibitions in New Jersey and Iverson Museum of Art, Syracuse, both in 1996. Accompanied these exhibitions were important texts that offered invaluable insight into Overstreet's practice and the provenance and artistic significance of the Senegal paintings. A common thread running through critical appreciations of this series A common thread running through critical appreciations of this series was Overstreet's compulsion to subvert abstraction, which brings us full circle in this talk. Writes Alison Weld, they take his abstract expressionist beginnings, his African-inspired canvases of the middle years, and his recent figurative expressions, and weld his experience into a monumental synthesis. Thomas Pichet Jr. considered the Senegal paintings as part of, and I quote, a significant and sustained aesthetic related to Overstreet's earlier Storyville and Tension series, and critically, and I quote, to histories that are downplayed or ignored in dominant culture chronicles, end quote. Notwithstanding these appreciations, it is certainly the case that we can neither underestimate the cultural and historical value of Overstreet's singularly unique commemoration of the Middle Passage, nor their magnificent and moving presence in the exhibition taking flight. Thank you.
Would you like to take some questions?
Yes.
Just raise your hand, I'll come around.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for the talk. As a person who's familiar with Overstreet's oeuvre or his kind of ways of working through series and patterns in his painting work, is there anything before or directly after that sort of stylistically preempts or I guess quotes the shift into this? Because in the exhibition as shown here, it is quite a departure from the other works.
A good question. Actually, it's a good question you asked there, and it is it's the work that I mentioned here. That's why I mentioned it. It's the series, the Storyville and Tension series. I can't remember which way around it is, but they're the ones that predate this work here. So obviously this work is the 90s, and then the flight patterns are the 70s. So there is. So I wouldn't say anything preemptive, but I think there is a conversation that he's having about abstraction and making this work almost purely abstraction, although it's not, but it's, when you go into that room compared to other rooms, it's a very different experience. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Okay. Yeah, if you want to see other works, yeah, of course. Yeah, well, this is, obviously a 60-year career is almost impossible to bring together in one exhibition, yeah. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Yeah.
This is very uninformed, a fairly uninformed comment in the question. But you use the word synthesis, which I really like, and I'm beginning to see better. It'll take a while for me to see better. But also I wonder if you kind of have a sense of what impact in our political view of the world, of Africa and the world, and not only Africa, but other places in the world, what impact Mr. Overstreet's work has, and I think because of your research will have, what is the path maybe, or maybe the progress that you see in that impact occurring? Okay,
that's a very nice question. Well, I think that one of the things I've been here for just a day, and I've been in the space quite a lot, and I have seen people walk in to that room and then look around, walk out. So it's like abstraction is kind of a language, and how do we engage with it? And I think this is, to me, what Overstreet's doing in the work is trying to show how things are interconnected, and who has a who has the kind of right to do who has the right to draw in different sorts of traditions. So this is why I started to think about him when he says in one of the interviews in the catalogue from 20, 30 years ago, he's talking to another art critic in his studio. The art critic's recounting the story, and he's kind of shocked because the art critic keeps talking about the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s, and Overstreet says, no, this is about Impressionism. And he says, Impressionism? And so it's really about even just that idea that he is wanting to connect this story about how we engage with the subject, the history, what his experience of going to Gori, this kind of pilgrimage to this place, and then to try and convey how you talk about this history. So he's not this where abstraction comes into it. You know, he's not coming to tell us immediately and represent that history because it's unrepresentable in many respects. So he's trying to get us to think really, and to look, and actually, you know, looking at having some of the details as well, is to think of just the amount of work that's gone into this, the mark making. You know, I had these images early on, if I can go back and show you this, these incredible details that were taken of the work, just the layers of consideration. This is not unthinking, you know, and just experimenting. This is formulating kind of the knowledge and experience. This is what he's trying to convey. Obviously, we live in a society where things have to mean something because they're on our phones or on TV, and they have to mean there's a kind of obvious representation. He's trying to do something different here. I'm not sure what it means in terms of society more generally, but I certainly think that engaging and being with the work and thinking about what they are about, what they start off being about, in itself is a kind of movement to think about this history of transatlantic slavery, the slave trade, and to think about how he's represented them very untypically in terms of the period of work that's been produced in the time that he made this, you know, in terms of outside of the genre or history of work that has looked at, artists that look at that history in figurative form. I'm not sure I answered the question exactly, but I wouldn't want to burden Overstreet with sorting out the problems of the world, but I do think it's about thinking about the world differently.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and coming here today
Thank you.
to talk about the importance of Black abstraction. So I'm thinking a lot about this idea of moving away or leaving behind or moving past the Middle Passage, and how real and tangible that is for a Black artist, and if there is a need to move past the Middle Passage for any of us, right? And I'm wondering, as a researcher of his work, if you think that he has moving past the Middle Passage, or is he continuing to process, as I think we all are, that horrific event that continues to exact a number of episodes of pain for folks of African descent in the diaspora and on the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. I when I read that, part of me was quite shocked when I first read it, when he said it, to go past. But, I'm not quite sure, I completely understand what he means, but I think it's about trying to deal with lots of different, different ideas of history, but then also his work as an artist and then what he's expected to do, And I think this is what the work challenges us to think about, how that legacy affects all of us. So abstraction, generally has been seen as a certain domain, and then to kind of enter in that, not just abstraction does he enter, he brings in an impressionism as well. So he's saying something about the language, the ways in which people, the ways in what we might think of as the Western world. So he's bringing different things together. And that's one of the things I kind of understand from why he's pulling these different kind of genres and movements and references to kind of take us outside of, quote unquote, some kind of conventional way of understanding that history. By chance, I listened to an interview that Toni Morrison did about 1997 when Beloved came out, and she said if I was going to write a book about slavery, it wouldn't have been very good. That's what she said about the book, and that's why she approached the book the way she did. And in a way, I listened to that because I was thinking about this talk, and I saw, thinking about her writing the book and what she said, and it's about how we try to approach a subject from a different perspective, to set off other conversations, because here is a conversation about colour and about depth and about things that are suggested, in the work. Again, I'm not sure I've answered the question, but just a kind of response to what you said. It's a great, and I'm glad you picked up on it. Any more questions or observations? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.